had never seen these people before, but beggars can't be choosers. I was hitchhiking and they'd stopped. It was as easy as that. I needed to get somewhere more civilized, and the company of a man and his son was probably better than to stay out in the middle of nowhere. The car itself was an older icy blue Volvo model, one of those cars with a box-like shape. The thing had probably been around longer than I had. The man had this long, horse-like face with sunken eyes, a kind of chronically tired-looking man with a hog-like nose and a tube-shaped torso. The kid sitting next to him, on the other hand, barely looked related. He was maybe 8 years old with short black hair and deep, dark eyes, pale as an egg. "Evening," I said. You're not heading anywhere Tomskog, are you?" "Tomskog," the man said. "Never heard of it."
"I've been there," said the kid. "That's far."
"Oh, so this isn't Minnesota?" "Son, are you lost?" the man said. "Definitely," I chuckled. "Absolutely. Sit down for a bit. We'll figure it out." I got in the car as it idled by the roadside. There was this stale smell of pine and cigarettes that puffed up from the cheap nylon seats. The man in the driver's seat turned to me. Without the lights from the dashboard, it was surprisingly dark. I struggled to see the details of his face. "I'm Alan," he said. "This is Fred." The kid turned around and flashed a big grin. He didn't seem to blink much.
"Hi,"
Fred said.
"We're on a big trip."
"A little father-son bonding time?" I smiled. "He's not my son," Alan said, completely stone-faced. A cold silence sunk over me as I realized this was something else entirely, and whatever it was, I didn't want to be part of it. I put my hand on the door, ready to get out. "Son, do you know where you are?" Now that I thought about it, I had no idea. I didn't recognize the area, and the air felt a bit different. Then again, it was too dark to see anything properly. Running into the wild here might be a stupid idea, especially in the dark. Then again, I didn't want to take my chances with Alan and Fred. "You're in Arizona," said Alan. "About 6 miles from Phoenix." "Phoenix?" My mind was spinning. How the hell I ended up in another town, let alone another state, was beyond me. Maybe the woman in the blue caftan had messed me up more than I realized. What date is it?" "It's the 21st, said Alan. "June. Well, 22nd now. It's just past midnight." I hadn't kept a sharp eye on the date while I stayed in St. Gall, but I knew for a fact that it hadn't passed the 15th. I had lost at least 7 days. I sunk my face into my hands trying to figure out what to do. But first things first, I had to get out of the car. I couldn't stay with these people. There was something fundamentally wrong with them, and I wasn't eager to find out what it was. If this whole ordeal had taught me anything, it was to trust my instincts. "We're headed up to Denver," said Alan. "You're welcome to tag along." "That's all right. I just needed to... I think you should come along," said Fred. "We could play games." "No need to. I will just drop you off at the next stop then," smiled Alan and started the car. "There's a gas station up ahead. I'm sure you can make your way from there." I quietly tugged on the door handle only to notice the child locks were engaged. Unless I wanted to ask them to open, I was stuck. "That'll be fine," I said. "I'll get off there." "Sure thing." As we drove north, I got a good look at the two of them. Alan was barely keeping it together. I could see his hands shaking and he couldn't keep his head straight. He kept moving like a bobblehead. His short brown hair was in disarray, and I could see sweat stains on his shirt. He was in a rough shape. Fred, on the other hand, was completely fine. He sat up straight and seemed attentive. If anything, he seemed unusually energetic for a kid. Excited even. It took us about 20 minutes before we got to the gas station. This single building lit up the night, drawing us in like a lighthouse. I could see a young man playing something on his phone inside. As we pulled in next to the gas pumps, Fred turned to me. "Thanks for the ride." "I appreciate it," I said. "Good luck on your trip."
"You're not coming with us?"
Fred asked. "I don't think so. I'm going straight back to Minnesota."
"We might go there next."
said Fred.
You can come with us?
That's all right. I'm good, I said. Take care. Alan disengaged the child locks and I hurried out of the car. I could see them looking at me from afar as I went inside the gas station. The light felt soothing after being in the dark for so long. The attendant perked up and put his phone away. He waved at me and I waved back. I was coming to the realization that I was probably running on adrenaline and needed something to eat. I asked for 2 hot dogs and a Coke. Paying for it quickly turned into a problem though, as all my credit cards were declined. Seems my family had pulled the last plug on our relationship. I stood there fumbling around my pockets for a while when I heard the door ring. It was Fred. Alone. He walked up next to me, looking at me with those dark, unblinking eyes. He couldn't stop smiling. Strangely enough, this was the first time I noticed he wasn't wearing shoes.
You want a hot dog?
He asked.
I'm hungry.
Sorry, I can't pay for these. The attendant sighed and put away the tongs, clicking them twice for good measure. Fred didn't stop smiling.
That's okay,
Fred said.
I don't really like hot dogs anyway.
There was a loud bang catching me off guard as the building went black. Some kind of circuit had fried, but not even battery-powered devices seemed to function. I could see the attendant's phone go dark.
I just drink the ketchup anyway,
laughed Fred somewhere in the dark. I just saw his outline, but he was quick. There was a little pitter-patter of feet and giggles as he ran off somewhere into the back. The attendant didn't seem to know what to do. He just froze. Hold on, I think there's a... No, wait. We were both fumbling in the dark. I could hear him move across the counter, knocking over a display, little plastic toys scattered across the floor. I headed for the door. The power seemed to be out, and I couldn't find the manual lock for the doors. I looked for a latch, but it was impossible in the dark. Excuse me, how do I heard the attendant fall over with a painful thud. Then he got eerily quiet. There was just this quiet gulping sound like someone sucking liquid off the floor. Hello? I asked. What, are you there? I moved around the counter and saw something looking back at me. Reflective eyes, like that of a cat. They didn't blink as they slowly bobbed back and forth, drinking something off the floor. The attendant didn't respond. I ran back to the doors and forced my fingers in. I could tell I was weakened, but I was still strong enough to pry myself through the doors.
You can still get a hot dog,
laughed Fred.
They're free now.
I could hear a little pitter-patter of naked feet getting closer as I forced myself through the doors. They slid shut behind me. Looking back, I could see Fred pressed against the glass, his hands covered in blood with a big grin on his face. His eyes seemed larger and even darker, but in the right light, they reflected at me.
I'll wash my hands, he said. Wait there, I'll get you one.
No way. I turned to run only to hear the clicking sound of a loaded gun. Alan was standing 10 feet away with a handgun aimed at me. He yawned, and I was afraid of his shaking hands might accidentally pull the trigger. I noticed how even the streetlights had gone dark outside. I could make a run for it, if only I could work up the courage. Calm down, Alan said. We're still heading for Denver, son. You sure you're not coming along? I'm sure. I'm sorry, said Alan. Fred seemed to take a real liking to you, and he'd love the company. Would you accept no for an answer? I wouldn't. I hadn't even noticed Fred getting through the doors. He was standing straight behind me, near enough to grab my arm. I considered picking him up and using him as a shield, but I got the sense that it would be the end of me. This was no ordinary kid, and this was no ordinary man. Fred held up a hot dog drenched in ketchup.
I got you this.
Thanks, I said. I'm not hungry, though.
Maybe just eat the fucking hot dog,
said Fred, his smile fading. So I did. They led me back to the car, this time putting me in the driver's seat. I noticed they made a few modifications. They removed the seatbelt from the driver's side, and the lock was disengaged by the passenger, not the driver. Fred had been the one in control all along. Alan curled up in the back seat, falling asleep instantly. Fred dumped a bag of snacks and drinks in the back seat, then got back up and sat down next to me. For a moment, I thought about just beating the kid up and getting out. I thought about it. Alan was already out cold, and this kid didn't have a gun aimed at me. So what was stopping me? Well, those eyes for one. Those cat-like eyes and that big playful grin. This kid was waiting for me to do something. To slip up. To try.
"We're going to Denver," said Fred. "And you're driving."
"You're kidnapping me?"
"I'm taking you home."
"What do you..." Fred slammed his little hands on the dashboard, causing Alan to explode into action. Shaking hands grabbed me and pulled me back into my seat. Fred's eyes lost their reflective sheen as his posture changed. Something about his voice shifted.
"You're wasting my time,"
Fred said.
"I have no interest in killing you. I'm taking you home."
Despite what he was saying, I couldn't help but feel that this was going to be a living hell. There was something in the way he looked at me just made my blood freeze. Like I was expecting a sudden punch to the gut that never came.
"Not here for a joyride. We're taking you home."
"How?" I asked. "How did you know where to find me?" Fred leaned back in his seat as Alan relaxed. No more than 5 seconds later, he was out like a light. Fred just stared straight ahead and lowered his voice.
"Our dads went to school together,"
said Fred.
"And I was asked to take you home, so I'm taking you home."
"I could just take a bus," I said. "You don't have to trouble yourselves."
"It's no trouble,"
grinned Fred.
"In fact, you'll be very helpful."
We got back on the road following the I-70 north. The plan was to go through Utah, then east to Denver. Fred knew the way by heart without relying on GPS or anything electronic. That the car worked at all seemed like nothing short of a miracle. Everything electric seemed to die when Fred got upset. Or maybe it was some sort of targeted effort on his behalf. I asked him to explain what he meant by our dads going to school together. Apparently, our dads had been in the class of 2000, along with a cast of other strange students. The one thing I couldn't wrap my head around was the timeline. It sounded like Fred was born around the same time as I was, maybe earlier. It didn't make any sense. I drove all through the night, stopping at random intervals for Fred to get out and check something. He stepped out of the car and just smelled the air, like he was looking for a scent. I thought about just taking off, but Alan would probably shoot me long before I got the car running. Fred would fall in and out of this sort of boyish character. In one moment he'd play sweet and innocent, and the next he'd talk like a fully grown adult. He'd relax his demeanor and put his feet up on the dashboard. We got off the highway after about an hour, instead taking back roads through smaller communities going north. Sometimes Fred would catch a scent, and we'd switch course. About an hour before the break of dawn, Alan woke up. He had this blaring alarm going off, and he shot up like a bat out of hell. We pulled over and I was asked to step out of the car. For a moment, the three of us just stood there on a back road in rural Utah.
"Look,"
said Fred.
"We'll get you home. But until we do, you're mine. Consider it payment."
"For what?" Alan smacked me in the back of the head just hard enough to knock the wind out of me. "Show some damn respect," he snarled. "We could have left you to be torn apart."
"For now, dear Alan, no need to get nasty," smiled Fred. "I'm sure we can make all of this mutually beneficent."
Alan opened the trunk and Fred crawled in. The trunk was lined with felt and plastic, and it had this soft smell, similar to a mild lilac perfume. Alan shuddered, leaving the two of us alone.
"All you have to do is drive," said Alan. "To drive and not to drive. I'll tell you when to do what."
I was allowed to rest in the back seat for a while when necessary, but only while wearing handcuffs. It seemed that Alan wasn't the trusting kind. We kept going north. Around 9 a.m. I asked if I could take a rest. Alan was fine with it as long as I wore the handcuffs. I crawled into the back seat and put the cuffs on, and did my best to make myself comfortable. After a few hours of silence, drifting in and out of a restless sleep, I tried to make a bit of small talk. "So, why are you doing this?" I asked. "Is it because of my dad?"
"In a way,"
nodded Alan, waiting to take a left turn. "And because of John." "John? John Digman?"
"That's the one." Alan was trying to navigate a series of small roads passing by dozens of identical warehouses. He was having trouble finding the right exit.
Frederick has worked with John in the past, Alan added.
I thought that was obvious. Obvious how?
Well, chuckled Alan, lights don't just turn themselves off, do they?
As I slept through the day, I kept having these weird dreams. They'd be normal at first, but at some point I started noticing that Fred was in them. And not like someone who was actively dreaming of. It was as if he was standing beside me, looking at my dreams and judging me from afar. It was so lifelike and distracting that I started to wake up after noticing him. But after a dozen or so times, I just stopped caring. He was simply there no matter what I did. After a few hours of sleep, I started to expect Fred to be there. It felt stranger not to have him there. I started to look for him, and I felt anxious when I couldn't see him. He was there. He had to be there. When I finally woke up, it was already dark. I must have been out for at least 10 hours. I was having cold sweats. I didn't even think. I just got out of the car. I found myself relieved to see Fred was up, and that frightened me. I wasn't supposed to feel relieved. There was something fundamentally wrong with this kid. Didn't he kill someone that previous night? Still, I couldn't help it. I felt safe knowing he was awake and watching, so when I was asked to get in the driver's seat, I didn't protest. But seeing my hands shaking as I placed them on the steering wheel sent a cold shiver up my spine. Was this what had happened to Alan? Over the next few days, we drove all around the state, stopping only for a quick bite to eat or a bathroom break. I would mostly stay in the driver's seat except for the hours where I slept in the back. During those hours, I could feel myself finally relaxing, the deepest, most serene sleep you can imagine. While awake, I'd feel myself stressing out over anything and everything unless Fred was in the car next to me. I'd see awful things at the side of the road. I imagined vaguely humanoid shapes coming out of the forest or seeing faces leap out in the dark. Sometimes I'd see something in passing cars, like a driver without a head or no driver at all. It was only during those first few hours after a long sleep that I functioned as a normal human being. Better, in fact. During the hours where it was just me and Fred, he'd sometimes have me stop at strange places. I'd wait outside apartment complexes or stop at dark roads in the middle of nowhere. Those few moments when I was left alone were absolutely terrifying. I'd hear strange noises in the wind or hear whispers coming from the trees. I'd imagine something trying to sneak up on me or see shadows grow longer. It wasn't until Fred came back that it all disappeared. Now, I'm not stupid. I know I was being manipulated, but when I was stuck in the middle of it, I didn't care. I just felt like this was the way things were supposed to be, and I did what I had to do. After all, Fred was taking me back to Minnesota, right? We continued through Denver down to Albuquerque. From there, it was a straight shot to Dallas, and then eastwards to Jackson, all the while taking side roads and avoiding heavy day traffic. Alan and I would take turns driving and watching Fred while he slept in the trunk. Days turned into weeks. We drove from Jackson to Indianapolis, stopping only to sleep, eat, and have the occasional sponge bath in the restroom. I didn't even question it, but I noticed I was growing more and more tired. I required more sleep, and it was getting harder to wake up. I could easily get up to 12 hours of sleep every day, and I wouldn't wake up until someone literally shook me. I remember one night as Alan was resting in the back seat, Fred had stepped out for some nefarious purpose, leaving me alone in the car with nothing but the horrors outside to keep me in check. I imagined something coming down the road, looking for me, something staring at me from behind the trees. Then I heard a thud. I looked back only to see that Alan had dropped his gun. It was just lying there. Carefully, I picked it up and examined it, hoping he wouldn't spring to life anytime soon. The gun was loaded. My mind was racing. I could take off running and no one would stop me. I could get out. I could go to a police station and call for help. Even the horrors outside seemed a little less threatening now that I had a weapon. I could do something. Anything. You mind giving me that? I hadn't even noticed Fred coming back. His mouth was covered in blood, and those reflective eyes held me hostage. I could feel this intense threat emanating from him, like a feral cat waiting for an excuse to tear my throat out. "No," I said. "Stay right where you are."
"Maybe you should rest a while," said Fred. "I'm sure you'll feel better in the morning."
"What? What the fuck are you doing to me?"
"I'm taking you home. Isn't that what you want?"
We're nowhere near home," I said, "and I don't trust you."
"You don't trust me?" Fred pouted. "Fine. Hand me the gun."
And I did. It wasn't even a conscious choice, it just happened. No more gun. Suddenly, someone was dragging me out of the driver's seat. Alan had woken up and he was pissed. He tripped me and started kicking me over and over while Fred watched. I couldn't help but curse myself for being such a blatant idiot. I had the chance, but I didn't take it. I handed over the key to my lock. Alan just kept screaming and kicking me while Fred giggled. I just coughed and groaned, trying to protect my face. Once the beating stopped, Alan dragged me to the back of the car and locked me in the trunk. You don't do that," Alan cried. "You don't point that thing at him." As I lay there trying to catch my breath, I heard Fred's voice come through.
"You're right, you know,"
he chuckled.
"I'm not taking you home anymore."
From that point on, I wasn't allowed to drive. The nightmares got more intense, the visions as well. It was as if Fred had gone from subconsciously messing with me to outright torment. I'd spent every moment of my dream looking for him, waking or sleeping. I'd have no peace unless he was near. There was nothing that could protect me but him, and he was trying to fixate my mind on that singular fact. I tried to fight it. I really did. But I just kept falling back into surrender. It was probably mid-July. I was sitting in the back seat handcuffed. Alan was driving down a long country road. I didn't have the slightest idea where we were and what we were even doing there.
"Pull over,"
said Fred.
"I'm hungry."
Alan stopped. We both watched Fred get out of the car and walk into the night. For a moment, we just sat there in silence as Fred walked off. Then Alan turned to me, his eyes wild. "Keys," he said. They're under the mat." "What?" Alan stepped on the gas. Tires screeched and spun as we swayed back and forth. The tires found their footing, and we sped down the dark country road going full speed ahead into nothingness. I fumbled around and found the handcuff keys hidden away. I had to turn the key with my mouth, but the handcuffs finally slipped off. The road was horrible. The further we went, the more terrifying it got. It was like falling into a hellhole, countless images of gore and death following us and appearing out of nowhere. And for a moment, I realized that this is what Alan was seeing as well. Without Fred around, we were both hopelessly terrified beyond an ability to function. And still, he stepped on the gas. "It's not real," he kept screaming. "It's not real!" Over and over and over. He barely managed to keep the car on the road. This was it. We were making a break for it. Maybe he was just as much as a victim as I was. I'm taking you home," said Alan. "I don't care what he says. You're going home. It's the right thing. It's right." A sign passed us by as we screamed down the road. "Welcome to Minnesota." Turns out, Alan had planned this for a while. Fred rarely paid attention to road signs, so Alan just kept slowly taking back roads further and further north. We just crossed into Minnesota, which was what he'd waited for. We couldn't escape while Fred slept, it seemed, as that was the one point of the day where his control was the strongest. During those hours, we were both just mindless drones. "When you get out, promise me to just go," Alan screamed. "Promise me." "I promise," I said. "Eyes on the road. Eyes on the road." Horrors from all sides, whispers telling me about the delicious juiciness of my innards, clouds shaped like behemoths, ready to come down and crush me into pieces. And yet, Alan just stepped on the gas. Horrors aside, we had to trust that none of it was real. We just had to go. I don't know how long we'd driven before Alan started to slow down. He'd look over at me every now and then just to make sure I was still me and not turn into something unimaginable. "I thought you'd be like him," Alan cried. "He said your dads had something in common." "It doesn't make any sense," I said. He's just a kid. He's not, Alan sighed. He's really not. It's just that shit in him. What are you talking about? Alan stepped on the brakes. Once the car came to a halt, he looked at me. Fred had a younger sister once, but she died. She was just 4 years old. That's awful. When that happened, the parents, they needed some kind of reassurance that they weren't going to lose another kid. A promise. A wish. I got a sinking feeling in my stomach. A wish, I repeated. You don't mean the Yearwalker, said Alan. That's what the two of you have in common. Both your dads did it, together. But his dad made it. Yeah, nodded Alan. And whatever he wished for made Fred into this. That's why he isn't trying to kill me. He already got a wish fulfilled. He's happy, just the way he is, sighed Alan. That's why he's always smiling. Alan stepped on the gas as we sped into the night. We kept going for a few hours. We passed Blue Earth and Fairmont, and as we started closing in on Tomskog, the road seemed to get darker. The visions were still there, but we were seeing past them. Both Alan and I were having cold sweats and shivers, both from stress and fear, but also just being on our own. We were breaking a bad habit. As Alan took a sharp right turn towards Tomskog, the pale headlights of the car suddenly went out. We didn't know what was going on. Alan sped up, even as I screamed at him to stop. We can't stop now, he screamed back. We can't! Crash. So I've edited out this part and put in an actual car crash sound? Thank you. I coughed, tasting metal on my breath. The seatbelt had held. Not so much for Alan, who was nowhere to be seen. The windshield was ripped apart, and a noxious fume was spewing into the air. I was probably concussed, maybe worse. I couldn't get my hand to move straight. There was this mechanical thunking noise as the engine died. I finally got the seatbelt off as I fell out of my seat and into a ditch. A snapping twig caught my attention as my head swiveled around. Fred. He grabbed my shirt and threw me down with the same ease as folding a paper napkin. His smile faded into a vicious grin, showing row after row of shark-like teeth. There was no ceremony, no pomp or frill. He was just going to fucking eat me. I shielded myself as a bang went off. Alan's gun. A moment, Fred laughed. The moment he let go of me, I ran. I promised Alan I would. Fred seemed frustrated, but he was more annoyed at the various bullet holes that started to riddle his body. Shot after shot, muzzle flashes lighting up the night. As the final shot rang out, there was an awful shriek, ending with a rubber-like snap. I looked back one final time.
Told you I'd get you home,
Fred laughed.
You're welcome.
A hysterical laughter echoed as I watched Fred drink the blood from Alan's disembodied head.